Hello again, 99ers. And hello again to, well, anyone else here watching a video about TI-99 for a video game classics in the 2020s. You're weird, but I like you. Last time we talked about the TI-99 classics, I looked at the first 5 in my list of the top 15 original era TI-99 games, starting from the bottom at 15 and working my way up to the top. So far, that list includes Popeye in platforming, Championship Baseball in sports, Return to Pirate's Isle in graphic adventure, Spad 13 in flight simulation, and Fathom in action adventure. But now it's time for part 2, and we're getting into some pretty heady territory here, making our way up into the top 10. It does get a bit harder from here on in. I actually have a harder time with this list, I think, than with any other part of the 15. At the one end, it's easy enough to say Popeye's number 15. I mean, not too many people are going to debate that. And at the other end of the list, well, the all-time greats that are genuinely just great in every way and hugely significant, it feels pretty easy to put those at the top. But ranking very good versus very good is just tricky. The way I went about it was, I gave every game points for playability, challenge and replayability, graphics and sound, novelty and uniqueness, and finally their place in TI-99 history, with my final ranking just being a summing up of those scores. And ultimately, I'm pretty satisfied with how it pans out. Some games are more playable and fun than they are unique and interesting, and some games are the flip side of that. But as far as uniqueness goes, my first game in this top 10 is one that's scoring high in that category. The only hit to that uniqueness comes by way of the fact that it does have a big brother in the TI-99 library that does share some basic design ideas with it. And that big brother is Fathom at number 11. But at number 10, right next to it, I've got Wing War, Imagic's last game for the TI-99. And Wing War kind of makes it onto this list on a technicality, I gotta admit. It wasn't actually released commercially in the 80s, thanks to Imagic being hit hard by the video game crash, and being essentially in survival mode from 84 on. They originally had versions of Wing War announced for 7 different systems, but in the end only one of those happened pretty much as planned, that being the ColecoVision version, which came out in this sad, un-Imagic-like labeling, but at least it came out and got a North American release. Otherwise, the 2600 version, which is pretty different, was released in small numbers and only in Europe. And a copy of the Atari 8-bit game came out, but came out on a compilation disc a while later, never as a cart. Which is to say, the TI-99 version didn't get any commercial release at all, making my including the game at number 10 here on a list of important 80s TI-99 games rather suspect. But, well, I have an excellent justification, or possibly a satisfactory one anyway. See, while TI-99 Wing War wasn't commercially available in the 80s, it did leak into the community almost immediately on disc, and in a fully playable state too. So user groups were able to pass it around, and it does end up with a place in the 80s TI-99 legacy, if only as a program in various user group libraries, there to endlessly confuse anyone who attempted to play it. Fathom was already pretty unique, but Wing War, and especially TI-99 Wing War, takes oddball action-adventure design to another level. In Wing War, you play a dragon, whose job it is to explore a fairly large game world, looking for treasure, crystals, and secrets. The game's basically asking, what if Joust was a multi-screen single-player action-adventure item collection game? Which is a kind of crazy thing to ask, but, well, this is Imagic. Play involves a fair amount of just trying various stuff, just experimenting and seeing what things in the world do, and what secret places and passages and items there are to find there. So just for example, and try to stay with me here, to wake the volcano and release the fire crystals to create the super crystal from the water, air, and fire crystal, you need to attack and kill the fire demon by attacking it from the bottom. Then you can take the crystal from the volcano's mouth and wash it in the green and blue fountains before returning it to your den. So this kind of thing isn't entirely arbitrary. Kill fire demon to get fire crystal? Kinda makes sense. But exploration and just trying stuff is definitely part of the design concept here, as far as arriving at solutions and understanding the cause and effect that makes the world work, and that has the potential to make your dragon more powerful as it discovers the mysteries that are hidden within the walls of its caves. Though the manual I wrote for it based on the ColecoVision and 2600 manuals will also help Wing War TI-99 players going forward a great deal, I think, by just giving you the lay of the land and a basic understanding of what the game's trying to do. Wing War's world really is the heart of the game and what makes it worthwhile and what makes it unique. The elements of fire, air, and water are a major theme, and there are fire, air, and water areas where crystals of those types are found, consequently. I have to wonder if Atari's Sword Quest adventures were an inspiration here, with their element theme, Earth World, Fire World, Water World. An inspiration there seems pretty likely. Something that really takes the TI-99 version to the next level as far as the world goes is that the TI-99 version and the TI-99 version alone has a destructible environment and uses it as a gameplay element to hide areas and secrets. So you can destroy earth and stone to get to new areas, and you have to, in a couple of cases, and to reveal items. Another kind of unsurprising thing that helps the TI-99 version improve on the others for me is speech, which is actually used during gameplay and sounds rather good.
Alas, our glory is now but a memory.
And one more thing this version has going for it is its enemies are just a bit more fleshed out and more interesting. Wing War is a forward-looking game that tried some really interesting things when it comes to action-adventure.
Alas.
And it actually is pretty challenging, too. Most people never manage to collect even one super crystal, that being the focus of the main gameplay loop. But hopefully more people can now that it has a manual to explain what on earth this game is supposed to be doing, and what you're supposed to be doing in it. Having played it a whole lot myself, I still haven't managed what I figure is my notion of a perfect run, where I'd have to collect all core items and treasures, including a super crystal, the dragon's mate, the egg, at least one treasure, and a super crystal. Maybe someday. Then again, I kinda don't want to. I want there to always be more Wing War still out there for me. One last glory run on the horizon. Anyway, I consider Wing War not just interesting, but replayable and challenging too. So it ends up at number 10 on my list, despite its being a game that got killed by the video game crash, then brought back from the dead by leaking into the community right away. What we got, as it turns out, is pretty darn cool. But the next game on my list is one that didn't miss out on attention from TI-99 fans in the 80s at all. And that's Tunnels of Doom. No caveats here. This is the classic early 80s RPG for TI-99. From that 80 to 83 era that gave birth to the modern idea of an RPG. Tunnels of Doom is the TI-99 contribution to that era, and it's a game 99ers come back to pretty often even today. There are a few different innovations that make Tunnels of Doom appealing right from the get-go. And one's the way it separates its RPG game engine from its game assets. That's a familiar enough idea where text adventures are concerned, on TI-99 or anywhere else, with the TI-99 Adventure cartridge being responsible for that game's engine, while the assets for whatever Scott Adams adventure you're playing right now are loaded from card or disk. But this isn't something you see quite as often in RPGs, a game cartridge which contains only the engine, with any adventure assets loaded separately. For Tunnels of Doom, though, that's a plan. You'll always be in some kind of tunnels, and that part's non-negotiable. But as far as what sort of doom is waiting for you there, well, that could be anything. And the kicker is it could also be created by just about anyone, since game assets being loaded from cassette made it possible for 99ers to create new Tunnels of Doom adventures. So if you want to go on a Star Trek-themed dungeon adventure as Captain Kirk, well, for whatever bonkers reason, that exists, and you can play it if that's what you're looking for. But whether or not you happen to be James Tiberius Kirk at the moment, in whatever given Tunnels of Doom adventure, you're still going to find yourself wandering in a maze of hallways. As I say, that part's non-negotiable. And while you do that, you'll be treated to first-person full-screen color graphics showing you the way, with a letter at the top of the screen also helping by telling you what direction you're pointing in. But when you run into an enemy, as you'll inevitably do, turn-based battles are going to be not in that dungeon corridor, but on a tactical battle map. There, we get another one of Tunnels of Doom's defining features, tactical encounters in which position and movement are important. You don't just go into an encounter screen and pick the fight option from a menu. You're on a battle grid, and your ability to close with an enemy, or their ability to close with you, matters. But if you're sneaking through the dungeon, you'll probably want to avoid encounters with dangerous enemies some of the time. And in that department, another unique feature of Tunnels of Doom comes into play. You can listen at doors to hear whatever lurks on the other side. Now obviously, the TI-99 PSG isn't the best at making the sounds of a ghost or a rat. Beeps and noises are what it does. But each enemy does have a unique sound, so if you know the sound an enemy makes in Tunnels of Doom, and you know what a rat squeaks like in Tunnels of Doom, you can identify a rat in Tunnels of Doom. In principle, anyway. Once you start exploring, you'll start thinking about what areas you've been to and what areas you haven't been to and where you need to still explore pretty quick. And, well, thanks to another major feature of the game, I'm happy to say that's probably not something you need to worry about. Put away the graph paper and pencil. Tunnels of Doom in 1982 features an auto map. You can refer back to it any time to figure out where you need to explore and where you've already been. So Tunnels of Doom has a lot of cool features, but is it a good RPG? Well, the answer for me is it really depends on what you mean by RPG. Tunnels of Doom is a dungeon crawl. If you want a story and characters and plot development, this isn't the RPG for you, clearly. If you want magic and monsters and dungeon battles, it just might be more up your alley. Tunnels of Doom is a product of its era, but it's a pretty rich and complex platform for dungeon adventure, as far as that goes. So I think it belongs at number 9 on my list of the greatest TI-99 4A games of the 80s. You just have to recognize what it is and what it isn't. But as for what it is, it's pretty great. Okay, so Wing War and Tunnels of Doom coming in at number 10 and number 9 add some big names to our list of TI-99 greats. And at number 8, we go back to where we started with this list, with a platformer. But this time, what we get is a TI-99 original that was never published on any other platform. And that TI-99 original is Bigfoot. Like Championship Baseball, number 14 on my list of TI-99 greats, Bigfoot is a Milton Bradley title, which was released for the MBX expansion system. But unlike Championship Baseball, it doesn't actually need an MBX, which is pretty important since almost nobody has one. It'll play just fine on a regular TI-99 4A, and for speech synth, it'll use the TI Speech Synth module if an MBX is not available. The synth is a little more consistent with the MBX, and some people like the MBX joystick, but those are the only differences. Gameplay is identical. And heck, these days everybody uses an Atari joystick adapter on their TI-99 anyway, so you can use any joystick you like, just like you always would. Bigfoot is one of those platformers that's built on a pretty simple idea that just happens to work really, really well. And that concept is you're a climber who's scaling a mountain by placing ropes strategically on the mountain's face, and you need to set those ropes in strategic places to make your way up the mountain without getting your face caved in by Bigfoot's boulders. Then you need to use them effectively to collect all the food and gold deposits on the mountain. Having done that, you head up to the top and cage Bigfoot himself. Now, being an alpiner on the TI-99 is admittedly nothing new, but flavor aside, I always appreciate a platformer that lets you reshape or interact with the playfield in this kind of way, where you aren't just a character navigating hazards. You're creating structures you'll depend on later, so you need to be thinking 2 steps ahead and thinking about the playfield as a whole. Graphically, Bigfoot is fine, but there's nothing mind-blowing going on here, and the sound likewise does the job, but it's nothing revolutionary. Regardless, it really is the gameplay that makes the game. Like Load Runner or TI Runner for us 99ers, it's a pretty simple concept that makes a pretty deep platformer once the gameplay is in play. Plus, like I say, it's a TI-99 exclusive, and it's one of the last official releases for the system, releasing after TI had pulled out. So all the more reason for it to be important in TI-99 history and on this list. Though the irony there, as far as the exclusivity goes, is that Bigfoot didn't start out its life as a TI-99 game at all. Like Championship Baseball, this is an MBX expansion system title, and before the MBX was an expansion system for the TI-99, it was a Milton Bradley game console development project called the Milton Bradley Gemini. When Milton Bradley gave up on the Gemini, they didn't just target TI with their MBX expansion system concept. Atari and Apple were targeted as well, but in the end only TI saw anything produced. The upshot being, like Championship Baseball, we know Milton Bradley originally developed Bigfoot for the Gemini, since its prototype photos include a Bigfoot cart. But with Milton Bradley getting cold feet when it came to the video game market, 99ers got to benefit from some of the titles that they'd been working on there. And especially with Bigfoot, benefit we did. So, starting out our top 10, we've got Wing War as a really unique action-adventure, Tunnels of Doom as a classic dungeon crawl RPG, and Bigfoot as a great platformer. But at number 7, I think we've got to address something that's still missing from this list. Tunnels of Doom, as I say, is an RPG in the dungeon-delving sword and sorcery sort of way, but it's not a world, with places and people and legends and lore and all that. It's got a system, but the engine doesn't offer much opportunity to tell a story with it. So, it seems like we still need to find an RPG with more meat on its bones in terms of lore and legends and whatnot in the 80s TI-99 library. And the place we'll find the lore and legends we're looking for, it seems to me, is Legends at number 7, which ends up being the most complete 80s-era RPG for TI-99, based on later expectations of RPGs anyway, where we expect swords and spells, and a system that uses fancy math to say how good we did smashing that big bad orc's brain in, but also with some flavor that tells us why those swords and spells matter to the world. So Legends is a welcome addition, even as a late arrival on the TI-99 scene. Like SPAD 13, the first TI-99 graphical flight simulation, it arrives in 1987. And it's something very different from what Tunnels of Doom had been on just about every level. First of all, it's a disc game, and it's actually a mix of extended basic and assembly routines. Most of the program logic is extended basic, so it runs a bit slow, but it manages. You start your adventure in the town of Wizard's Rock, which is the only town on the island where Legends takes place, and it's consequently where you do all your RPG town stuff you'd expect to do. From there, you can set out into an Ultima-style overworld, though. And one thing that makes this game interesting is specifically that it isn't trying to be Ultima. Legends is actually based on a 1985 SSI RPG called Fantasy. And so I find it more interesting today just because, while it looks like a conventional RPG of its era at first glance, it doesn't play much like one. For one thing, monster attacks in the overworld happen in real time instead of being turn-based, so you can be attacked regardless of whether you're moving or standing still. For another, its dungeons are going to seem pretty unusual if you haven't played fantasy. They come in two kinds, monster dungeons and item dungeons. Monster dungeons have monsters as the threat and golden potions to be found, whereas item dungeons have traps as a threat and equipment to be found. And these dungeons are mostly where you'll find what the game has to offer in terms of flavor and setting. There are some encounters and bits of lore to be found there, and dungeon areas have flavor text associated with them that'll tell you what sort of area you're passing through and what you're seeing around you. But that flavor text might seem pretty strange unless you read the backstory in the manual, which explains that Edenland had a natural disaster event, which created massive fissures, which swallowed up the buildings and structures of the world, which is why subterranean caverns are now home to most of the remains of civilization in Edenland. So you'll fight monsters and explore dungeons to gain strength and, well, eventually defeat the evil Ashtar Creel, who's the big bad here. Legends is a grindy game, and the initial grind to get up to a level where you can start exploring is pretty rough. But I don't mind a grind myself, and its graphics are really nice, so there's something to enjoy there. And its items and spell system genuinely give you a feeling of progress as your party gets stronger, with spells including damage, healing, buff, debuff, and dispel options. So, kind of the basics. Your party is a party of 4 and includes 4 classes with different bonuses and spell lists. And you can roll up and name new characters, which you should because the default party the game gives you sucks. You're required to have a party of 4 including all 4 classes, but you can reorder your group as needed in battle, so there's some party structure strategy there anyways, regardless of needing the 4 classes. Legends does have a sequel, by the way, cleverly titled Legends, the Sequel. But for the purpose of this list, I'm lumping them in together, as the sequel doesn't change much design-wise. For me, these games are a real testament to the TI-99 community and its perseverance and determination to keep this machine going. The fact that the platform was still getting new and exciting games through to the end of the 80s, long after it left the retail market, is pretty great. I might have to do a separate video on Legends at some point. This video could easily have turned into me talking about 3 other games for 5 minutes, then talking about Legends for half an hour if I let it. Okay, so our TI-99 Best Of list now features an action-adventure, a dungeon crawler, a platformer, and a weird 1987 RPG. But what's next is a game that's not on this list for ticking any particular genre box, since I don't even know what genre to call it. That game is Star Trek Strategic Operations Simulator. And I guess it's a game that really manages to tick my I'm an obsessed Trekkie who needs Star Trek to infiltrate everything box. But seriously, Star Trek SOS is a great game, not just on TI-99, but on plenty other platforms as well. Which is worth addressing. Like the game that started this list, Popeye, Star Trek SOS gets docked some marks for uniqueness and its place in TI-99 history, just given it got ported to almost everything, even VIC-20 and 2600. But like Popeye at 15, despite being everywhere else too, it's just too good to ignore. This is a game I have a hard time rating graphically, because it's a port of a vector game, so no home system really looks like the arcade original, and nor should it. But I also think graphics in this game are a bit of a damned if you do, damned if you don't business, since one thing I like about the original is the starkness of the graphics really puts the focus on the emptiness of space. A lot of the time looking at graphics on a system like the TI-99, we'd be asking whether it's using big, beautiful, colorful, multi-sprite characters or what have you. But in a case like this, a starbase far off in space really just shouldn't be all that big or beautiful, from my point of view. Regardless, I think this game lands at a good
Entering
middle
sector
ground as far as that goes.
2.1.
The game can be played with a joystick, but because the control scheme is pretty complex, that usually won't make sense. That involves combining button and direction inputs to create additional inputs, which, yeah, just too much trouble. Necessary on a 2600, not necessary here. We have a keyboard. We might as well take advantage of it.
Entering
While this
sector
game sees
2.2.
spaceflight as something that happens on a flat plane, I really can't criticize that from a lore standpoint. Star Trek as a universe is convinced that ships just always meet facing each other head-on at the exact same angle.
Entering
So,
sector
what can I
2.3.
say? Consistent. That's just how Star Trek space works. And I've got no problem with it working that way here. The final enemy in Star Trek SOS is Nomad, the rogue space probe from the original series episode The Changeling. So that's a weird choice of big bad, but maybe that was inspired by Star Trek the Motion Picture having reused the Nomad plot, to the point where people nicknamed it Star Trek Where Nomad Has Gone Before. In any case, you're mostly fighting Klingons, which is mostly what you expect. But this isn't the first time 99ers fought the Klingons on their TI-99. Out of the starting gate, the TI-99 got TI Trek as one of the first commercial basic games for TI-99, and I've covered it elsewhere on this channel. And here in Star Trek SOS, it got one of the best third-party cartridges for the system. Of Sega's 3 games for TI-99, Congo Bongo, Buck Rogers, and Star Trek SOS,
Maneuvering
all are
sector.
graphically impressive in their own way, but Star Trek is the most playable of the bunch for sure, and offers the most long-term challenge and replayability. Difficulty progresses at a moderate pace, but later on it gets hard. Plus, it's just as graphically impressive as those others, with its multiple perspectives on the playfield. And to top it off, you've got that TI-99 hallmark, speech synth,
Entering sector 3.2.
which is pretty nice since computer voices are also a Star Trek staple.
Automatic defense procedures initiated.
Anyway, considering all that, I think Star Trek SOS belongs at number 6 on my TI-99 best of list, even if it isn't unique to the TI-99 by any means. So, that adds 5 more to our top 15 TI-99 greats, with the list starting with Popeye in platforming, Championship Baseball in sport, Return to Pirate's Isle in graphic adventure, Spad 13 in flight simulation, and Fathom in action adventure. And then continuing on today with Wing War in action adventure, Tunnels of Doom in RPG, Bigfoot in platforming, Legends delivering a different kind of RPG, then Star Trek in strategic operations simulation, I guess. I suppose this top 15 has talked about titles that sold numbers in the hundreds of thousands, and titles that presumably sold numbers in the hundreds at best. Because, well, not all that many people had a fully expanded TI-99 system they were buying new disc games for in 1987. Next time I take on this list, I'll be talking about my top 5 all-time TI-99 classics, so I guess it might make sense to hold off on skewering me for what I left out until the list is done, and it's perfectly clear that I've completely left out all your favorite games. But if you want, you can get a head start on it now. Seriously, tell me what games you think should be in the top 15 all-time for TI-99 if you haven't already. Especially the ones that might be easy to miss. All those late 80s disc game classics.